The federal government brought down the budget yesterday. It was on November 4th. And we did some reporting here at Energy Media, and I have to do a little mea culpa. I have to walk back some of my criticism of the climate competitiveness strategy. Under those kinds of circumstances where you're reading these massive 500-page documents in a very short period of time, I kind of missed how profound the change was around federal electricity policy and what the strategy was. So I'm going to be talking to Fernando Mello, who is the Senior Director of Public Affairs and Federal Policy at the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, about this. So, Fernando, my take on this is that we finally have policy and strategy and budget where electricity is seen as the foundation of Canada's 21st century economy. Would you agree or disagree?
Absolutely agree. So much like you, I had some time yesterday to sit down with colleagues from across the electricity industry and folks in from government to go through this document in detail. And honestly, I'm quite impressed with the centering of Canada's uh, climate strategy on electricity. It's less of a climate policy that we've seen in the past and more of an industrial strategy that realizes we need low cost, low emissions electricity. And they do a lot of their work to know to put in place wind, solar energy storage, our component technologies in that. And they've put in place a lot of the key elements that we need to get things built in a rapid succession. So I'm talking the clean electricity investment tax credit, which we've been waiting for a while, but they've made it slightly more accessible. And we're obviously going to wait for the legislation on it, but that's going to be a key part of it. We see a renewal of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which has been a key financer of these projects, especially for Indigenous equity in those projects. And we're seeing a key recognition that if Canada wants to access new markets, if Canada wants to develop its own sovereign AI strategies or any of those other pieces, they need electricity and they needed it yesterday. So it's refreshing to see.
Fernando, I had Normand Mousseau from the Trache Energy Institute on yesterday, and he made a very interesting point. He said climate policy over the last 10 years, primarily under Justin Trudeau's Liberal governments, focused on punishing the emitters with carbon tax and clean fuel regulations and so on. But the approach that we need is to reward the innovators, to reward the early adopters of electric technologies and renewables and all of the connecting technologies and like transmission and so on. And that Normand's words were ringing in my ears as I read through the strategy again, because that's kind of exactly what this does.
It really does. And there's some interesting points to it. So they've doubled down on industrial carbon accounting and pricing, and they're really emphasizing the accounting these days on how they're doing it and trying to think of ways in a new federal, provincial, territorial conversation on those emissions because they want to look at how do we unify many different disparate markets while reflecting that. And how do we reward people for making the right choices? You'll note in there they continue the accelerated capital cost allowance, which is great for private businesses working to put solar and storage behind the meter. It's going to help that because you can stack that with the investment tax credits and really get things going. So there is a lot of effort and carrots being put out there to do that. The one area we are missing is for everyday Canadians to adopt low carbon technologies. Although in conversation, federal government officials were very keen to emphasize that this is their first budget and their first kick at the can for it. And that I would say they did a good job.
I actually like the emphasis on industry because if you look at the composition of much of the provincial emissions, you'll find, particularly in Alberta, industry makes up, and Alberta's like 31% of national emissions. And if you include Saskatchewan, the two of them make up 50% of the country's entire emissions. A lot of it is generated from emissions, from the oil and gas sector. And
Hmm.
I would actually argue that the industrial emitters carbon tax is not a good way to go because and Alberta shows us why. Because what they did was they broke it. They broke the market so that there are all these surplus credits in the market, and they drove the effective price of the carbon tax down to like $20 a ton. So it's ineffective. So that strategy only works if they police all 10 provinces and the territories to make sure that their markets are functioning properly. They don't have too many credits. Industry is behaving itself. I'm not as big a fan of that industrial emitters carbon tax as I once was, to tell you the truth.
I understand that, and that's where there's some refreshing pieces on it. I mean, they do talk about developing a post 2030 trajectory and working to fix benchmarks and improve the backstop piece so that you do get some of that. But really, as you and Norman pointed out, the rewards are what's going to really drive that piece. Um, I'm really keen to see that, and I know we're going to get some serious acceleration across the country. Right now, we have 17 gigawatts of open procurements. And with this strategy in place, I can only see more and more electricity procurement for renewables coming online and energy storage as well.
Yeah, there's a much bigger emphasis in this budget on and in this on this strategy on electrification of industry and manufacturing of electrotech. So we're
Yeah.
talking about batteries and electric vehicles and industrial heat. And Canada has a lot of heavy industry like aluminum and steel and forestry and mining and what have you. And they're very quietly behind the scenes. There's been a lot of innovation in things like industrial heat batteries and industrial heat pumps, and there's so much more we can do now. And not only does it reduce emissions, because I want to make this really clear, it improves efficiency and lowers costs. So it actually makes our industries more competitive. That's the thing that really stood out for me in this strategy.
Completely agree. And as someone who most of his family works at Dofasco in Hamilton, very proud Hamiltonian, even though I am here in Ottawa, that's the sort of initiatives that make it really positive for me and bring it home on that. So it's going to drive investment in renewables, but that investment in renewables will enable all of those other net investments to be more efficient and better use of our economic competitiveness.
Now, one of the things I didn't see a lot of, I know it was mentioned, but from my point of view, I didn't see the emphasis that it maybe deserves, and that's storage. Over the last 2, 3 years, the cost of batteries, at the BESS, the
Hmm.
battery energy storage systems, have become so efficient. So energy density's gone up, prices fallen off a cliff. They're now, really good. But what I'm hearing from engineers, grid engineers, is it's not just as storage for wind and solar, it's storage for the entire grid because there's so much more you can do now with batteries and arbitrage and voltage regulation and all of that kind of stuff. What's your take on the role of storage in this strategy?
So the role of storage in the strategy is not, again, as you say, not just to help extend the sunshine for another 4 hours. It is going to be allowing here in Ontario to take some of the excess nuclear generation that you have overnight, store it for those peak periods. They will allow that flexibility. They're going to allow a lot more resiliency in the grid as well because they're put on major lines. So you can actually have, just say there is a small fault in the area. It can help smooth that out and make sure that crews are able to get in and respond in time. And I do think we're going to start seeing a lot of behind the meter batteries really helping folks, even at the household level, if it's they charge overnight and they use it during those peak periods, or you're going to see it in industry, heavy industry. We're starting to see some serious interest in that so that they can, again, solar and storage behind the meter to help reduce their load and the amount they're paying and increase their competitiveness and the amount they're able to turn around.
That when I said earlier that my interest is actually higher now in industry than in residential, that's kind of what I had in mind. And the reason I have it in mind is because I've been interviewing people, experts outside of Canada, who are specializing in that, and companies that are, for example, even in the United States, where they're using American-made solar panels and batteries, which are way more expensive than China and still cheaper than gas or nuclear or whatever. And what they're saying is the cost of the technology now is not as big, it's not an issue. It's the integration.
That's
That's the really key. And sounds like you would agree.
I would very much agree. So, Canria has been a long time proponent of including grid integration technology in the investment tax credits. Now, obviously, the budget document, even though it is over 400 pages long, is still high level. We're going to need to see the final text of the Ways and Means motion as well as the Budget Implementation Act to really get into those nitty-gritty details and what's included and what's not included. But that is something we have been advocating for several years, is that those, to use a very high level term, and I'm sorry to all the engineers watching and my colleagues specifically, the two-way line capability to be able to feed in and out to really enable those distributed energy resources to talk to each other and to engage in a meaningful way with the rest of the grid. It's going to be incredibly important.
Now, here's an interesting thing. Down in the US, of course, US President Donald Trump is famously against wind and solar. But what's happening is the demand for electricity is expanding so quickly and to such a magnitude that businesses and residential units are turning to distributed energy resources as a hedge against an increasingly unreliable grid. And so the demand for electricity is the thing that finally seems to have lit a fire under the kinds of technologies that many of your members at CanRIA are selling in the market.
Exactly. And so that's where we've actually, one of the things we've been pushing forward, and we do note there is a statement saying the federal government will consult on this. Now, in Canada, we don't make a lot of renewable energy technologies at all. We had a period during the FIT program. That's a whole story involving a lot of misthought product policy and leading to job losses, which really tragic. But we've been pushing for what's called a domestic content adder. So trying to come up with a way to bring those technology manufacturing here. Because in the US, even though President Trump has drastically changed the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and all those other items, you do still see a significant interest and support for manufacturing in there. So we need to sort of find a way, how do we integrate and think about that in a as Canada and a Canadian industry? How do we fit into this? How do we take advantage of those diversifying supply chains? And then how do we make sure that Canadian industry can really take advantage and compete, involve, and have those investments here?
Fernando, the last time I think it was last year that I interviewed you last, and even a year ago, we were having a very different conversation about the role of renewables and electricity in the Canadian economy. This is the conversation we wanted to have, that we thought we should have had, and we weren't having, and how much has changed in a short period of time. And maybe that's how we'll wrap up this interview, if you could answer
I
that.
mean, you put it that rightly. I think everyone who's working in the renewable energy industry is just looking left and looking right and going, you know, the game has changed. We are now seeing active procurements from in almost every province with significant advantages from the investment tax credit. We're seeing capital flow north because we have a stable policy environment. And that's only being deeper entrenched and with a further recognition from a variety of parties on the federal level and at the provincial level. And we're now seeing a long-term runway for growth and a commitment to it in a way that's not partisan. We're no longer woke energy up here. It's just get it done. And we're seeing it from a variety of parties and a variety of interests. We're seeing new models and new business coming forward. And we're seeing so many new market entrants in a way that like this is the kind of time that as someone who's been working in this industry for over a decade now, I'm excited about. And it's wonderful to see because as you put up, this is the conversation we wish we were having last year. And I think this is the conversation you and I have wanted to have for many years. And the conversation I've been hoping you've been had on the, oh, gosh knows how many years I've been listening to and reading your work.
Well, it's been a long time. We're in our 17th year and heading into our 18th soon. But I'll tell you this much, Fernando. A lot of the excitement that I share with you is because other countries are ahead of us. And even the United States, in a lot of ways, is ahead of us. Certainly, Europe is. Certainly, China is miles ahead of everybody. And the kind of dynamism in the economy that we're seeing in other economies because of electrification, because of investment in on the generation side and the connecting side, the demand side, all of that is revolutionizing economies in the 21st century. And finally, it looks like Canada may be on that path. Look forward to some more interviews with you on this topic. So thank you very much for this.
It's my absolute pleasure as always, Markham. Have a wonderful day and thanks for taking the time to talk to me.